Hey guys, I'm coming up on my 4-year anniversary of when I switched to Fuji as my primary system for photography, and I thought it would be a good time to update you on my Fuji lens lineup. Now, while I don't think I'm all that interesting as far as someone you should take very seriously as an artist, I do have the benefit of having shot with every single Fuji X lens in the system, as well as many third-party lenses created for the Fuji X system. And in many cases, I've done extremely in-depth reviews and comparisons of most of them. So when I say that I've arrived at a lineup that I'm satisfied with, I do think that maybe I've earned a little bit of street cred when it comes to providing some value to you, hopefully. So I'm going to share with you what I've arrived at as my favorite lenses, what I shoot with on a regular basis. Now, there are quite a few lenses here. Many will argue there are too many lenses here. I don't completely disagree with that, but all of these lenses have earned a place in our kit and we shoot with regularly for the most part. There may be a couple exceptions that we're thinking about selling, but for the most part, every lens here we use, and if we don't use a lens, it doesn't stay. And in most cases also, I've done detailed reviews of these lenses, and the links to those reviews are below as well as timestamps to help you navigate in case there are any lenses you want to go straight to or lenses you want to skip. You'll find all of that and more below, because I also have links to lens calculators if this is your first time. If you're trying to find the right Fuji lens to shoot with, the right one for you, I've created some calculators to make that easier, as well as some videos to help that easier. So there's lots of resources. But before we dive into more about these lenses, I do want to tell you guys about my online workshops. I've been reviewing and teaching Fuji gear for many years now. I used to teach high school photography also. And for the past 4 months, I've been putting together a curriculum which I'm calling Fujiversity, which is an online photography workshop series. And right now I'm offering live remote workshops held once a week, but also the recorded version of those workshops for on demand. These are still in beta, so they're discounted, but they won't be for much longer. So if you're looking for somewhere to turn to help you learn how to use your Fuji device, and also to just better improve your photography skills in general, please check out the link here on the screen or in the description. But that's enough chit chat. Let's get into some lenses. And to do that, we will start by talking about the zoom lenses. And the most important zoom that I own is this one. This is the 50 to 140 2.8. This lens was my first purchase and is a fairly important addition to any serious photographer's lens collection. It's weather resistant, optically stabilized. It's a telephoto, super telephoto zoom lens. And for me, this lens serves many purposes. First and foremost, this lens is absolutely essential as a wedding/event lens. If you're a serious wedding or event photographer, there are times you need a good reach, and also you're never quite sure ahead of time what sort of focal length you need. So flexibility is absolutely a requirement. And although for me personally, like I said, I prefer primes even at events. Sometimes you just can't reach the stage or clear across the room to the wedding couple without a super zoom. And although f2.8 on an APS-C device isn't the very best for low light, it does get the job done. And getting the job done is what this lens is absolutely for. It's a workhorse of a lens, and it's the one you get if you are serious about professional or semi-professional photography. It also is one of my favorite lenses for the studio, actually, as well, and for the rare fashion or lifestyle shoot that we do. Certainly in these settings, you're not going to need or want the shallow or extreme shallow depth of field that you can get with some of the primes. And beyond that, this is just one of the sharpest lenses that Fuji makes. Normally you would assume that the primes would be the sharpest, but this one is, it's absolutely on par with any of Fuji's amazingly high quality primes. But outside of paid work, it's also just extremely important if you're like me and you're a dad and your kids are into sports and athletics or performing arts. It really is a must-have. And I'd even say add to that the 2x or 1.4x telephoto extender. That's always helpful for when you're just really too far away from the action. With these two, you'll pretty much be able to have access to everything you'll need to for photographing your kids, and you won't have to get, say, that 100 to 400 millimeter Fuji zoom lens. And even outside of my kids' events, I also like to take this on the occasional adventure. It is a large lens, so I don't always do this. But when we as a family, I know we're going to be out doing things at locations where the kids are going to be spread out and far away from us, This is the lens that I'll occasionally take, but especially when the family adventures involve the desert. Where we live, it's incredibly sandy, dusty, and it's nice to be able to have a lens that manages these dusty areas and keeps that all out of the sensor pretty well. And the last reason, though, that I love this lens is for landscape work, of course. It's fairly common for me in a landscape situation to become overwhelmed with the wide scenes that are there. With all the details and all the things you could photograph, it can become overwhelming. So it's nice to be able to shoot tight and compose out in or out elements into my shot. Having something that can provide a tight or narrow focal length, and especially with a lens that is as sharp and high quality as this lens is, makes it so much easier for me to digest the scene. I can hone in on a specific interesting thing in the landscape and just photograph that. So for me, when I'm headed out to do the occasional landscape work, this lens is essential. The next telephoto lens that I have is the 50-230 variable aperture lens. This lens and the 50-140 have some redundancy, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you own both. The only reason I do is because I had the opportunity to buy this at an extremely affordable price, and it's earned the right to stay in my kit because there's a very specific time that I love having this lens, and that is when we go on vacation to the beach, which we do regularly. Danae's sort of a beach bum. She's a California girl. She loves to go to the beach. Beach isn't my favorite thing, but when I go there, this is a lens I grab. One of my favorite things to do when we're vacationing on the beach is just to sit there and be lazy. I don't particularly want to run around on the beach, get wet, get sandy. I just like soaking in the sun and watching my family have fun together. So having a small lens with tons of reach is what I love this lens for. Sure, a 50-140 with that 2x extender, like I said, would work fine for this sort of photography. It'd also keep out the dust better, but it's big and it's heavy, and I don't particularly want to lug it around with me on vacation. The 50-230 is really light, it's small, and for that huge zoom range, especially, like I said, and it's not a huge sacrifice just to throw in the bag. But that is literally all I use this lens for. I don't use it for my kids' events so much because it doesn't isolate the action very well. It doesn't have that narrow depth of field, certainly that the 50-140 has, and it doesn't do as well in low light. So I wouldn't recommend it for performing arts especially. My next zoom lens is a recent addition. It's the 16-80 f4 lens. This lens is my primary travel lens. When I go on vacation with my family and I have little idea ahead of time what I'm gonna wanna have as far as focal length, I take this lens. But like I said, I normally would prefer a prime actually, or a couple primes and swap between them. But the reason that I use this is because I'm a hybrid shooter. I switch between video and photo, and with the optical image stabilization on this lens, which really is the best that Fuji offers in any of its lenses, it's just the lens I want to use for handheld video and that kind of hybrid shooting that I like to do on trips. If I just did photo, I wouldn't shoot with this. So this is the lens that stays on my camera for most of the trip, like I said, and in that regard, it replaced the lens I used to use for that when traveling, and that was the 18-55 2.8 to 5.6. I still do love that lens a lot, and I wholeheartedly recommend it for anyone who wants a really good image on a budget, especially lightly used. But when push comes to shove, I prefer this one for its improved OIS and its continuous aperture and slightly more flexible zoom range, and it helps that it has weather resistance. My last zoom lens is the 16-55 2.8. This lens is one that I don't actually use very much anymore. It's probably a prime candidate for selling, but when I think about selling this lens, I always have a hard time committing to it because it's just solid. This lens is excellent, and for years I've used it a lot on the streets of San Francisco where I travel a lot for work because I like the flexibility, I like that it's weather resistant, and it's provided some of my favorite photos from those trips. Its quality is just stellar, and similar to the 50-140, can easily compete with any of Fuji's primes when it comes to sharpness, color, clarity, all of those things, controlling chromatic aberration. But when I do use this lens on the streets, I do feel a bit too conspicuous, and I don't mean because people will notice me doing street photography and I get self-conscious. I personally don't care. I don't try to hide when I'm doing street photography. The only thing I do care about is that people notice it and I become a target. It's fat, it's kind of beefy, and it could attract the wrong kind of attention, so maybe not the best street photo lens if you're in a dangerous area, but that's really the only reason that I hesitate to use it. We also thought we would use it more for the events that I do especially, but in practice I've just learned more and more that I love the primes, and I stick with the primes for the wide to mid focal distances. So this lens just doesn't get used. So it does remain to be seen whether we will keep it. For now, this ends up being stuck over on that camera over there as a B camera lens. It's just on that camera all the time. It doesn't get used much for anything else, and it's performing below its capability by being stuck to that camera as a B camera. So yeah, it's probably got to go, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know why I'm still talking about it. Good lens though. So that's it for my zoom lenses, and some people are surprised that that's all I use for zoom because I don't use any of Fuji's ultra-wide zooms. I'll come back to why that is later, but for now, let's take a look at the long end of the prime lenses, and we'll start with this beautiful creature here. This is the 90mm f2. It's simultaneously one of my absolute favorite Fuji lenses, as well as being one of those lenses that I shoot the least often, even though it's one of my favorites. This lens, from all the tests that I've been able to do, remains what I believe to be Fuji's most sharp lens. It's right up there with the 80mm 2.8. It is by far my favorite portrait lens because of how it's able to keep so much of the face within appropriate depth of field range, but also compress and blur out the background so well. In my opinion, it has the best bokeh rendering, even better than the 56-1.2. And as I said, in ideal circumstances, it's one of my favorite portrait or headshot lenses. On the X-T3 and the X Pro 3, it's incredibly fast at focusing with that quad linear motor. And this lens can absolutely work as a quote-unquote dad lens as well, if you don't mind being stuck to that tight 90mm focal length. On the other hand, it just doesn't get used either as portrait or family lens very much because you have to back up so much further away from the subject, and often there just isn't the space for us where we're shooting. When we go to portrait shoots and we don't know how much room we're going to have, we almost always choose the 56-1.2 because we know we'll have a little bit more flexibility, and in family situations the 50-140 makes more sense for the same reason. So this just doesn't go with us all that often, and although I absolutely love and adore it, I probably would sell it for that reason alone, except for one thing, one reason why I will not sell it, and that is that this year I came to realize that I absolutely adore it for street photography. While it's still larger than I'd like and maybe draws a little attention, it's not as bad as those Fuji zooms, but what I've been learning is that I really love the way the 90mm focal length compresses a subject vis-a-vis the background. Most people don't use this type of focal length for street photography traditionally. Usually folks will stick with a 23mm focal length on Fuji or a 35mm focal length on full frame. Shooting with a tighter focal length like this is more difficult and requires a lot more advanced planning. It's harder to react immediately to what is happening around you. But I find the focal length refreshing as you tend to focus a little bit more on intimate details and emotion rather than that wide figure to ground relationship that you would traditionally get with a wider lens. So yeah, I don't really want to sell this lens, and I look forward to when I can travel to San Francisco again and shoot with it more. The next lens we've got is the 56-1.2, and it's all wrapped up. There's a good reason for that. I just had this lens CLA'd, and what does that stand for? CLA, it's like cleaned, lubed, and adjusted. That's what it is. So this lens was having some major issues as far as like grinding. It sounded awful, and I think that was because some dust had got into it. I have used and abused the crap out of this lens. This is our most used lens. I'll tell you why in a minute, but it needed some help. And Jared, he actually reached out to me and said, hey, I would love to do some work for you in return for a shout out. I have no problem giving Jared a shout out. I already did like him a lot because he contributed one of my favorite photos to the photo contest we did last year, Do Good With Your Camera. Jared's photo was just beautiful of I believe, a child who is suffering from an illness, cancer related, I think. Big fan of Jared already, so that was a no-brainer for me. So anyway, Jared just took care of business on this guy, so I'm gonna open it up while I talk to you about why I love the 56-1.2. We've used this lens more than any other lens in our whole lineup here. This is the lens that gets used hands down. So let's first just sounds crisp. and smooth. No more grinding. And it just looks beautiful. Thank you, Jared. Lovely work. I'm excited to start shooting. We've been without it for a little while, so I'm excited to start using it again. This lens gets used a lot. It's probably with us, it is with us to every single shoot that we do. While I still believe that the 90mm f2 produces the better portrait, all things being equal, this lens it's just a bit more flexible to work with. And also with that 1.2 aperture, it makes it so much better to use in a low light situation. And I find myself in those a lot for event work. So this is my A lens on my A camera at event work. It's on my camera up to my eye 80%, 90% of the time. And I just love the photos I can get with it. I did mention that it's our default lens for portrait situations. We use it for both tighter headshots, but also we'll scoot back out of doors and use it for family photos as well. I can think of dozens of family portrait shoots that we've had with this lens where it was the only lens that we took out and used the whole session. And I can pretty confidently say that if you want to be a professional portrait photographer and you do your work outside, you may not need any other lens. This lens has probably earned itself back for us 100 times over. So while it is an expensive lens, it's just pretty much the lens you get if you're a portrait photographer. And I guess wedding work for that matter. We stopped shooting weddings a while ago, but when we did shoot weddings, this was our primary lens. So yeah, it's a really great lens. I take it with me to my documentary style trips as well. I like to capture America's Southwest with it when I need a tighter focal length. I also occasionally use it inside at home with the family because in low light, it's the best that Fuji has. But even more than that, sometimes you're just in a mood for that focal length and that incredibly shallow depth of field that it can give you. It's not quite as sharp as some of others Fuji lenses, but you would never know that unless you've done some serious comparison and pixel peeping with it. But if you do want to get serious about photography, it's really hard not to recommend this lens as one of your first purchases. Next up, we have probably my third most used lens of all my lenses. This is the cute little 35mm f2 XF lens. This is the lens I use when I want my camera to be small, and it's also my second favorite focal length. I love the 35mm focal length on APS-C or the 50mm focal length full frame because of how versatile it is. It really is one of the few ways I see the world, and I love that when I bring that camera up to my eye, what I expect to see is what I see. This is my when in doubt lens for travel. When I don't mind having a large lens on my body, it's the 16-80, like I said, for my when in doubt lens. But when size does matter, when I want small and I don't want to be burdened, or I'm not doing video, this is the lens that I have with me. So this is the lens that I often have on my camera when I go for a hike, when I go for walks, when I head to the park with my kids, when I go on adventures with the family. This is the lens I take with me when I go to the grocery store, when we go out to eat, motorcycle trips, when I want a small waist pouch to hold my camera with. This is the lens that I choose when I'm walking around the small towns that I like to document. And I even use it for the occasional studio shot. So yeah, it's a very versatile lens that I absolutely love. It focuses extremely fast, it's weather sealed, it's plenty sharp, and it's affordable. And now it's even more affordable if you don't mind getting the plasticky version of that. Supposedly the image quality is just the same between the XC and the XF version of this. So if you're on a budget and you want flexibility, but you want compactness and you want good quality, look no further. Next up, we have the 23mm 1.4. This lens is really excellent and pretty important if you, like me, prefer primes, but you also need to shoot professionally. You pretty much are going to need this one probably. While I said earlier that you can pretty much shoot with the 56-1.2 and only the 56-1.2 at any portrait shoot, sometimes though you're stuck up against the wall, you're inside, maybe you're in someone's living room, maybe you've got an active kid you're working with and it's hard to focus tightly on someone who's moving out a lot. That 56-1.2 doesn't always help you in those really hard to focus situations with an active child. This lens works a lot better. At events, this lens is also pretty vital, and that's because again, sometimes you need to go wide, but you also are in low light. So this usually goes with me to every event. But similar to the 35 f2, this focal length is very versatile. And I've taken this lens with me to a variety of activities, family adventures, though it's not usually my first pick because to me it's just sort of a boring focal length. And that's just personal feeling. Most people do default to it though. but I prefer to go more extreme usually. It's an extremely high quality lens though, definitely produces sharper and more contrasty photos than the slightly less impressive 23mm f2 lens. I've captured some of my favorite memories with this lens for sure. Now guys, let's just slow things down a little bit, maybe put on some romantic or dramatic music, because this next lens is the most glorious lens ever made, which it's the beauty of the 16mm 1.4, which I could not love anymore. I don't think I can accurately describe to you the joy that I experience as I take photos with this lens. It is so visceral and it makes me so happy. This lens goes with me to literally every shoot that I do. The first reason that I love this lens so much actually has less to do with the lens itself and more to do with the 24mm focal length, full frame equivalent focal length, which I love. I love the way subjects look when the background sort of wraps around them. I love the lack of compression. I love the playfulness that comes into play on a subject. I love the challenge that comes when you're trying to compose all of those elements in the environment and put that into a tangible composition. For me, it keeps photography so interesting, so challenging, and I love everything about it. So like I said, it is my favorite focal length also for capturing some of my favorite type of photography to capture, which is documenting America's Southwest, and that's both indoors and outdoors. Again, the playful field of view really captures the style that I'm going for with these photos of old signs, old dilapidated buildings, small decaying details, and the tired landscapes that I see. And in those rare occasions where I'm able to enter a home and speak with folks in these small towns, it really works great in those small places that are hard to capture and also have a lot of low light. But even more than the focal length, I just love this lens. I love how close that it can focus at that 1:4 reproduction ratio. And I bring it with me to all my adventures to see what sort of details I can capture with it up close. I love that you can shoot close, but you can also include all of that background just falling off into beautiful obscurity with that lovely bokeh that it can produce. I also love it in family settings where I have lots of kids and pets. It's nice to be able to capture the numerous subjects that I have to capture in a tight space. And again, having a 1.4 aperture is very helpful for low light. And even for portraits, I know most people wouldn't consider this a portrait lens per se, but I love the way that it renders my kids' faces. And I often prefer it to a classic impression that you would get with a tighter focal length in a more traditional portrait setting. It's also just very forgiving on how, and capturing movement because it's so wide. You can capture all the movement of a kid or a pet and also capture it in a playful way. Finally, I absolutely love this for landscapes. I know it's more traditional to use zooms in a landscape situation, but with 24mm being my favorite focal length for landscape, I usually just plop this lens on my camera and compose the scene from there. And I don't mind having that field of view imposed on me even in a landscape setting. So yeah, it's hard for me to overstate how much I love the lens. It's not the easiest lens to shoot with, but I do find it the most rewarding. And for that reason, it finds my way on my camera bodies more than just about any other lens in every type of shooting situation that you can imagine, even when it's not the lens that most people would consider the quote unquote right lens for that situation. Which leads me to this lens, which is another 16mm lens. This is the Touit. Now, there is no good reason for me to own two lenses at the same focal length, and I have had for a long time every intention of selling this lens. But in my defense, this lens is actually more of a 15mm focal length. It's a little bit wider, and I'm not sure why Fuji markets it as a 16mm lens. But regardless, the place that I've really had a lot of fun with this lens is on the streets because it's so inconspicuous, and also the adventures where I want to save on bulk, where I just want small lenses but still want that focal length. It's sort of my backup for the 16mm 1.4. But probably the biggest reason why I can justify keeping it is because it is the lens that I love to use on a gimbal, and I do a lot of event videography with it, so it's earned the right to stay in my kit for that reason. Finally, my last lens, it's not a Fuji lens. This is the only one that is part of my daily kit that is not a Fuji lens. I told you earlier that I don't use Fuji zoom lenses for shooting at the ultra wide end, and that is for a very important reason. If you've noticed anything from my photos, you'll probably seen how much I love to shoot really close and wide when I shoot wide. And that is why I do not shoot Leica M. That is why I don't own either the 10-24 f4 or the 8-16 2.8 super wide Fuji zoom lenses. None of those focus very close, and I find that extremely cramping to my style and frustrating, because otherwise those lenses are absolutely superb, and otherwise I might be a Leica shooter. The lens that I've arrived at just for that is the 12mm f2.8 Zeiss Touit. This is the most recent addition to my collection, and I was really hoping that I wouldn't have to buy it. I did try a few third-party wide-angle lenses first, but I just was not happy with those. So see the playlist linked above if you want to see that full journey of how I finally arrived at this guy. I haven't shot with it long enough to really feel like I can give a strong review about it yet, but what I can say is that it checks all of the boxes for the reasons I wanted it. It gives me an ultra-wide field of view. It's super sharp, incredibly sharp from what I've seen so far, and it focuses closely. So the only thing I wish is that maybe it was a little smaller. So there you have it though, that's my collection. As a quick review, I'll show you on the screen now the several kits that I use in various circumstances, because we do a lot of different types of photography, and I think it might be helpful for you to see what all of the lenses that I use in those different situations together, because obviously I don't bring all of these lenses with me to every shoot. The last thing I want to briefly discuss is how I see my collection changing in the future with the addition of some new gear coming out. In 2020, Fuji is supposed to release that bokeh monster, the 50mm 1.0 lens. We still don't have a firm release date on that lens, and I've got to think that COVID-19 is putting a damper on that release schedule. But when that lens comes out, yes, we will be absolutely purchasing that lens, and unless it just is incredibly soft at the 1.2, it will definitely replace the 56-1.2. For me, a larger lens wouldn't bother me so much, because where I use this lens is usually in a professional setting. So having something better in low light, it's also a little bit bigger, that's no problem for me at all. So I'm excited about that 50-1.0, although I'm not obsessed with bokeh. That's not why I want it. It really is just to see how it changes our event work. The other change I think we'll see is that when we get our hands on that Fuji X-T4 with that in-body image stabilization, that is going to be a game changer, because it will allow me to relinquish the 16-80 f4, which I now rely on for video, like I said, because of that optical image stabilization. But I would much prefer to take along 2 or 3 primes traveling and swap those out, and not have to rely on a zoom with an f4 aperture. I'm a prime shooter, so having IBIS is really exciting to me, and I'll if it can compete, if the IBIS works as well as the OIS does in this lens, no question, this is gonna go. And I'm excited about that. But we'll see what happens. I hope you stick around for that journey if you find this stuff interesting. If not, you know, I don't know why you're watching this. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. What does your kit look like? How would you like to see it change? What do you think of this setup? I'm sure many of you will think this kit is overkill. Maybe it is, but these are lenses that we use. So I'll probably do a video soon though of what I would use if I could only have 1, 2, or 3 lenses in the kit. Which would I pick? Might come to that anyway with where the economy is going, so it's probably worth the mental preparation to go through that exercise anyway. So subscribe if you're interested in that. That's all for now, guys. I really hope you enjoyed hearing about all this, and I look forward to hearing what you guys are using. In the meantime, remember to do some good with your lenses, and we'll talk to you again real soon.